us on the list. We're sort of in the build-up. One of the purposes of this webinar is we're sort of in the build-up to our annual offering of the Strategic Partnership with Impact seminar. And just a quick reminder about that. That will take place over 3 days in October, the 18th, 19th, and 20th, and we're in Chicago, just outside of Chicago, actually being hosted at Discover Financial Services. So thanks to Discover and the Center for hosting that. That seminar is where people learn a more in-depth version of some of the tools that I'll talk about today for connecting talent to strategy. So I hope you'll all consider that. Maybe take a look on the Center webpage for the Strategic Partnership with Impact seminar. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about some things I've been working on lately that have been drawing on some of those tools in a little different way, and in particular maybe touch a bit on the ideas of meritocracy and performance management, which has been coming up a lot in my work with organizations, and it looks like some of these tools are finding a home there. It's obviously a big topic. Ed Lawler, my colleague Ed Lawler, and particularly Jerry Ledford led a research study and then an edited issue of the World at Work Journal recently, which you can also find on the Center website, and that deals with performance management and some of the evolution and advances in performance management as well as examples. So as I go along, I know it looks like my colleague Alan Colquitt from Eli Lilly is on the call today, and he has been really quite inspirational and instrumental in sort of bringing my attention to some of the literature and some of the thinking about meritocracy that I may mention later. So welcome to everyone. Again, as Carrie said, if you have a question, probably best to type it in. I will try and stop here and there for questions, but if you can remember to type it in, then Carrie can keep an eye on it for me and remind me if I missed something, or also I can keep an eye on it as well. Okay, so with that, I will move to the first slide, and we'll kind of explore some of these ideas, and I'll give you a sense of how they've been playing out lately. So Carrie, I am clicking. Okay, great, thank you. So perhaps as a matter of context, one of the projects that I've been very much involved in over the last 3 years in partnership with my colleague Ian Ziskin and supported by Carolyn Rarick has been a gathering of now over certainly more than 70, probably about 100 CHROs and other thought leaders, and we call it the CREATE project, C-H-R-E-A-T-E, so CREATE with HR in the middle of it. And you can read more about that at a site create.net and also at the Center. Basically, this group came up with 4 pillars that represent areas where they felt like the profession needed to disruptively accelerate to meet the challenges of the future. The top one is probably very relevant to what we'll talk about today, the idea of aligning HR with value creation. The group kind of concluded, and again, this is a very strong, very leading CHRO, so they're all doing terrific work, but even this group concluded that the logic that connects HR to value creation is often missing or pretty vague, even in the best organizations. Very often our leaders don't know what to ask for from HR. Very often it's difficult for leaders and certainly for employees and managers and others to really see a very specific connection between not only what HR does, but really just the work and the mission of the organization. And that's particularly true in a world where strategies are changing all the time, something that Chris Worley, Ed Lawler, and Sue Morman have written a lot about in terms of agility and ambidextrous organizations. So the first 2 really get at something this seminar is all about. What is the connection between the investments we make in HR, improving talent, improving the organization, and the mission, and then how do we improve the expectations of HR's key constituents in terms of those connections, making them clearer, and in terms of what they should be asking of HR. And then in the bottom 2, that requires rewiring the work and the operating models of the HR profession itself, much more reaching out to other disciplines, much more use of models from other disciplines. I'll talk a bit about that here as well, bringing concepts, for example, from engineering that optimize the investment we make in performance to bear on performance management. And then finally, this idea of ensuring the HR talent pipeline. And again, if you think about what we're doing at the Center, this seminar is a part of a certificate in effective organizations designed to give people some of the skills that they need to manage the HR function, but really more to be a partner with the organization in the future. So this is mostly context to remind people about the CREATE project, and I think we'll see hopefully some links to what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to focus mostly on the implications of these tools for high performance, and I'll give you a sense of the kinds of things that we'll do in the seminar as well. And again, all due credit to my colleague Alan Colquitt at Eli Lilly. He and I have written a couple of blogs together that you can find on the web. He's also well published in this area. So if you type in that name, Colquitt at Eli Lilly, you'll find some links to what he's done. So what does high performance mean? I think we throw that word around a lot. We talk about having a high performance culture. We talk about wanting high performers in all of our positions. We say to our workers, please be a high performer. We often construct HR systems. Obviously, performance management is getting a lot of attention right now to hopefully foster and develop and motivate high performance. One of the things that Alan and I have written about lately is that it's possible meritocracy is a bit overrated, particularly the idea that you can just apply meritocracy and there probably are very few downsides and maybe you'll get the benefit of motivation. As it turns out, there are quite a lot of downsides to meritocracy when it's applied and it doesn't fit. And one of the things that Alan has pointed out to me is that it looks like the evolution of performance management is in some cases, in his case explicitly, but in other cases implicitly, actually trying to remove some of the variability and some of the emphasis on finding the very top performers, et cetera. My conclusion here is that high performance has a very nuanced meaning, and throwing a word like high performance around without a clear meaning can actually create a lot of confusion. We'll see that in a moment. High performance varies with the strategy. It means very different things depending on what your strategy is. High performance varies with the situation that your workers and others find themselves in. High performance doesn't mean the same thing in every situation. And as we'll see at the end, it's a complex interaction, actually, of the value that performance creates, the availability of that performance, and the cost of creating that performance. And those are three elements that any engineer, any designer, anything like that would tell you need to be considered whenever you're considering what we mean by the value of high performance. So again, now I'll kind of talk a bit about how some of the tools that we've used to connect talent to strategy might relate to this. This is probably one of my favorite questions when I begin a session with CEOs or a C-suite team. If I ask your workers, do they know precisely where they need to excel and precisely where good enough is sufficient? How far can I go below you before that answer doesn't match your own thinking? I've seldom encountered, I don't think I've ever encountered, a group of C-suite team leaders or unit-level managers that didn't squirm a bit in their chairs when I asked that question. You might try it at home, I guess, the next time you're with your leaders. The idea, of course, is how clear are people when it comes to the work they do each day, when it comes to where they put their priorities in a world of limited resources, how clear are they that they know where to push hard for excellence, where, in a sense, meritocracy really makes sense, and where is it that good enough is sufficient? And I know that sounds heretical to some people, like shouldn't everybody be always striving to be the best at everything? But it's not. That's not a practical world to live in, and it's not a practical thing to ask of our people. Basically, what I usually find talking to CEOs or unit leaders or others is that they say, I have to say, we throw words around like high performance, innovation, customer centricity, et cetera. I've probably got projects I'm working on every single one of those. And the reason for the projects is that leaders have agreed people don't really know what that means. And they certainly don't know what it means in the sense of getting on with the work every single day or knowing how their work would change if our strategy changed, which is kind of the purpose of some of the tools we'll talk about. The seminar and the logic of this talk really is based around a model that Pete Ramstad and I developed some time ago. Many of you are kind enough to say the book Beyond HR remains something that you use a lot. And basically, if you look on the right, it involves 7 boxes sort of hierarchically that start at the bottom with the investments we make, which produce policies and practices, which produce outcomes in the workforce like culture and a capacity to do things. that culture and capacity leads to observable actions and interactions. Those actions and interactions add up to things like organization structure, social networks, and the talent that we have available to us. And then those things, 7 through 3, support execution, the pivotal resources that we need to have and keep and protect, and the processes, the transformations that we undertake. And that all is how we support this mission of sustainable strategic success. Excuse me, and as Chris Worley and Sue and Ed and others have written, that sustainable strategic success idea is a moving target. And in my view, this kind of clarity becomes even more important when the target is moving. Change is not an excuse to be less clear, but rather an excuse to have a mindset and to have an expectation that people will constantly be asking questions about the linkages between these things, because they will change. Pete and I divided them up into 3 anchor points on the left side. Efficiency has to do with what policies and practices do we deliver for the investments that the organization gives us, cost per hire, time to fill, et cetera. Effectiveness has to do with asking, when we do a policy or practice, whether it's training or recruiting, et cetera, does it work? Do we get better people? Do people
John, if you can hear me, we can't hear you now. All right, everybody, hold on just a second while I try to get John back on the line.
Can you hear me now, Carrie? Sorry about that, folks. I have no idea why that call dropped. So, Carrie, about where did I leave off?
I'm not sure.
Had I started talking about this slide?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm at the risk of repeating a little, and I apologize for that. I have no idea. My connection shows it's perfectly good. So thank you, Carrie. Let me know if I drop off again.
Okay, you were on the left side talking about anchor points.
Oh, great. Okay. So you can think about those 3 anchor points as an interesting way to broach a discussion with leaders. They all are necessary, but we can think about efficiency being what policies and practices do we deliver for the investments that we make, cost per hire, time to fill, et cetera. How can we save money delivering our processes and practices, for example? Effectiveness is when we deliver them, do they work? So if we deliver policies and practices, do we create a change in the workforce that leads to different interactions and actions? So if we train people, do they learn? If we recruit better, do we get more applicants, et cetera? That's all really good stuff. What I'm talking a lot about today and in the seminar is a third question, which we call impact, which is basically when we do all this great stuff in HR, are we sure that we are directing it at the pivot points? That's not to say there aren't lots of things that you'll do for everyone, always, that there aren't lots of things HR needs to do, even when it isn't directed at a pivot point, but that we need to ask that question, particularly with our discretionary resources, particularly when it comes to our workers who are being asked to make decisions all the time. So we've already got a question about how open will people be to this new way of thinking. Organizations have built a lot of policies and practices from Nancy. Thank you very much, Nancy Harris. Organizations have built a lot of policy practices on meritocracy. Nancy, so this is a great question. I'm going to get to that in a moment. I wanted to sort of seed the discussion a bit. I'm delighted you reacted with an early, maybe provocative idea that perhaps we need to think more carefully about when meritocracy has might have bad effects. So I'll continue, and if I don't answer your question, and certainly if you have a follow-up, let me know. Okay, so the impact question really is, I think, pretty central to the idea of what we mean by where pushing for meritocracy makes a difference. And then the effectiveness and efficiency parts, for example, might be applied to performance management to say, well, we want to implement performance management programs in a way that is cost effective. Maybe that means engaging leaders with them. Maybe it means doing things in the cloud, et cetera. And then we want to see that those performance management practices make a change. Maybe people are having better conversations, et cetera. That would be efficiency and effectiveness. What I'd suggest is that the process of performance management is very, very vital, but also the content of performance management is vital, and that content may depend more on an impact discussion. So one of the fundamental questions that the tools we talk about in the seminar are designed to address is this one. If we wanted to create the largest improvement in strategic success of our business or our business unit or even a functional area like supply chain or finance or et cetera, where would improving our talent or improving the organization, both social and formal, where would that make the biggest difference to improving the success of our business? And let me give you a quick example about what I mean by that. This is an example that has been featured in Beyond HR as well as in Retooling. It's an easy one to teach, and we actually use it at some length in the seminar. So I'll refer to the idea of Boeing and Boeing's decision in the early 21st century to compete with Airbus. And so if you think about how we might approach this from a strategy change standpoint, Boeing had for years operated competing in a certain way with aircraft. They all were pretty much the same, flew the same distance, et cetera. And then Airbus introduced the A380, the largest aircraft ever built. And that really changed the game. Suddenly, Boeing did not have an aircraft that large to compete with Airbus. Boeing decided not to build a large aircraft. It decided to build an aircraft that was larger, but that was much more built around features such as economical performance, comfort in the cabin, and the ability to fly a long way, even though it held fewer passengers. And that's the now familiar 787. So an understanding of that strategy and the differentiators leads you to realize that the processes and resources required for that strategy, on the process side, we're going to need to create a global supply chain, part of which is shown here with lines showing you what part of the plane the different countries make. And that more diverse than anything Boeing had done. On the resource side, Boeing was going to build this aircraft not out of aluminum, but out of something called composites, which is a very high, sophisticated plastic, often stronger than metal. So we're going from an aluminum world to a composite world, and from a world in which we have a somewhat more limited supply chain to one that is much more diverse. It's a pretty good question to ask yourself, what will be the changes in our talent that will be most pivotal to executing this strategy? I think if I asked most organizations about that and said, you know, where are the talent pivot points, in my experience is I get good answers, but pretty generic answers. Well, this means that our engineers are going to be pretty pivotal, and we need our engineers to understand that it's a new world in aircraft. We need to be supplier-centric, might be something we would say. We need to be composite-savvy, that sort of thing. Again, my feeling is that very often the workforce doesn't really know what those things mean. They don't know how to execute them. They'll make a good try, but it's often what they think it means rather than a really clear vision and that's commonly held. And that's where this tool that I've moved to the next slide on comes in. So there's certainly a whole logic of going from the strategy to the processes and resources to finding pivot points in those execution elements. But one of the things that you end up concluding is you come down to this job of engineer, and indeed engineers are a pivotal position. That is, they're going to make a big difference, but perhaps not for the reason that you said. And this is where we get into what I think are some messages about meritocracy, et cetera. Carrie, I'm just checking. Still hearing me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if you look at the left side, if you were to draw a line down the middle of this, on the left side I have what the Boeing engineer work looks like in the aluminum world. In the aluminum world, the Boeing engineers have decades of expertise. Basically, they set the standard, and they say to the vendor or the supplier, this is what I need you to build it out of aluminum, and bring it to me when you've built it, and I'll tell you if it's any good, and I'll tell you if it fits our specifications. That's the world that Boeing has built engineers in for decades. So at the bottom, I've applied a tool that I call a return on improved performance curve, but it's really a variation of something you find in engineering. I was just doing a webinar, I think Christoph is on the line with some colleagues in Europe about this. There's a tool called a Kano diagram, K-A-N-O. It's a Japanese gentleman who invented it. And this is standard in engineering. And the gist of that diagram is this. If you're building something, every component of it does not need to be the best possible performance and the best possible quality. Every engineer knows that. Every marketer knows that. Every designer of a product or service knows that. Some things need to be good enough, and improving them gives you no more value. Some things, improving them gives you more value in a linear way, and other things are not valuable unless you get them almost perfect. Now, the same thing I think is true when it comes to work, and it's this clarity about strategy that lets us see it. So let's look at that tool on the bottom left of this diagram in the aluminum world. Let's go inside the work of an engineer. What does it mean to be a high-performance engineer? Well, in the aluminum world, you can see technical engineering is sloped upward. That means that movement to the right on performance creates movement upward on strategic value. In the old world, collaboration flattens out. On the left side, very poor collaboration, illegal, improper, etc. Of course, that's a big problem and creates a lot of negative value. But in the old world, once someone's pretty good at collaboration, maybe the middle of the performance scale, we don't get a lot more value by having them be exquisite at collaboration because they're basically just checking specifications. That's not trivial, but it's not something that really rests on collaboration. High performance means a very different thing in the post-aluminum world. On the right-hand side, we're building things out of composites. That means that the suppliers often have built things longer than Boeing. It means you give them parameters, like a wing box that needs to do something, rather than specifications about how a wing box would be built. It means that collaboration, getting their creativity, getting their good ideas, becomes much, much more significant in our strategy. So this job of Boeing engineer, this job of aircraft engineer, which has always had technical engineering and collaboration in its job description, and if we say be a high performer, that means a completely different thing under this new strategy. Yes, technical engineering remains important, but improving technical engineering, particularly in the aluminum world, does not help us very much. That's why that curve flattens out on the right. On the other hand, collaboration now becomes more pivotal. Going from good to great on collaboration makes a huge difference for us. And you can find, and in the seminar we'll talk more about this, lots of examples of this where engineers and others were featured in the employee magazine for collaborating with vendors, where vendors came up with ideas that the engineers didn't even think of. I'm fond of showing a video of a supplier to Boeing, and the video does not show their company name at all. Everything in it is about the 787. That's the kind I'd love to meet the engineer that motivated that supplier to make that video. It's really like exquisite collaboration. So you can see, this is what I mean by the idea that you say to an engineering group, well, you know, be a high-performing engineer. And by the way, we're going to change our strategy to make things out of composites. My question to the leadership team is, how clear is it to an engineer that my job has shifted, as we see in the diagrams below? Now, you don't have to be able to measure the curves in terms of numbers, although there are some situations where you can, and I'd love to kind of study those more in depth if any of you want to do that. But to me, maybe an even more interesting thing is just to give people the idea of what these curves represent, and then talk to, in this case, your engineers. How would they draw the curves for the different parts of their job? So you can see now, Nancy, I'm hoping you see meritocracy on technical engineering was great in the left side of the world. Meritocracy on technical engineering may confuse people on the right side of the world, and we may have engineers trying to continue to be great technical engineers, when in fact what we want to say is you should shift your resources. Once you're good enough on engineering, shift over and be a great collaborator. We should move our incentives that way. We should move our coaching that way. So performance management, the process may look similar, but the content of performance management looks very different on the left side and the right side. And again, when you speak about agility, I think these kinds of changes are happening not everywhere, but in targeted spots in the organization. Change in the strategy, change in the environment, those kinds of things prompt and require changes in the way people set priorities about their work. And yet I think for the most part, even the best performance management systems, even the best descriptions of the work tend to leave high performance and its definition up to the individual, or they tend to say high performance means being great on everything, something that I'll return to in a moment. So that's kind of my quick example to hopefully introduce the idea that this notion of high performance is really something that we need to pay more attention to, what it means, what its content is, and that maybe, in a way, retooling performance management to see it through the lenses of tools like this may let us get a better connection between performance and strategy. The implications for HR, thinking about the effectiveness and efficiency part of the model. Our reward and recognition system changes. We might reward suppliers for great ideas. We might have, one of the things that Jerry and Ed have written about is the idea of going to cloud-based 360-degree information for performance. That 360 might now include suppliers to tell us which of our engineers is a better collaborator. We celebrate an engineer who brings in an external idea, not necessarily just the engineers that came up with a brilliant idea themselves. And you can see as we look down the slide, the same thing is true with development, the same thing is true with staffing. So it's a real, albeit a bit stylized example, but the idea here is that there's kind of a seamless connection between the impact part, the part that tells us how the engineer job has changed because of our strategy, and then the effectiveness part and the efficiency part. And clarity about that and a discipline to say, are we understanding the pivot points, I think can go a long way to improving those first two pillars of the CREATE project. Really articulating the value of HR, helping our leaders, our workers, and others understand what it means for the work to be connected to strategy and what they should expect from HR. Just to give you a benchmark here, this is kind of the entire summary of the story about Boeing engineers told through the model of the HC Bridge model. I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you, but I'll point out two things that did come up a lot in the seminar. So on the left-hand column, you can see the linking elements that we talked about before, and I've defined those for you a bit. On the right-hand side, you can see the storyline that's told about Boeing, in this case about Boeing engineers. And then in the middle, I've framed the model in terms of a set of questions that Pete and I came up with. One of the lessons and one of the messages of the seminar is it's in this day and age, it's often more powerful for an HR organization to ask great questions than it is to expect to provide great answers all the time. So for me, the epitome of great HR would be that questions like these, maybe you'd reframe them yourself, maybe have a different framework, et cetera, but questions like these are the kinds of things that the HR community ought to be asking itself. And as we get toward the top of the model, questions like those are the kinds of questions HR should be posing for its strategic leaders, its unit leaders, et cetera. And I think even just asking those questions will at least unearth some discomfort about what we mean by high performance, what we mean by customer centricity, what we mean by innovation, inventiveness, et cetera, terms that often are allowed to be, are placed out there, and workers or others are allowed to create meaning in them. And I think we can do better on the content of performance. And again, I'm hoping you're seeing that meritocracy, I'm going to go back one slide here, meritocracy, or two slides, meritocracy applied to the wrong place, a search for who's best, rewards based on higher and higher performance, applied at the wrong spot, it can actually maybe be harmful or cause people to direct resources to the wrong spot. My theory, my hypothesis is that in most work, people just don't have a real specific idea about these kinds of trade-offs, and that we could enhance organizations a great deal by being clearer about them, particularly where they make a big difference to our strategy. Okay, so moving on, this is an example of something that I've called retooling, and this is a grid from a book that Wayne Cassio and I put together about strategic HR management through the lens of risk. In the middle row, what you see is the example that I have given you. On the left side, you see a kind of typical approach. Leaders say, I want top performers in every position. I don't want any risk of bad performance. I want people who are good at everything in the job description, et cetera. That would be like telling an engineer, I want every component of everything you build to be at the highest possible quality and tolerance. And obviously, any good engineer will push back and say, I can do so much better for you if we understand where good enough is sufficient and where high quality really pays off for us. That is not as typical a pushback for an HR organization, and I think leaders can better understand it applies just as much there. So the framework in the middle, we could call it performance tolerance analysis, we could call it a Kano diagram, but the idea is that in most management frameworks, you optimize performance, you optimize what we might call meritocracy against its costs and benefits. So the retooled approach on the right in that middle row would be, yes, we want to optimize risk. We want to minimize risk in places where risk is very costly to us. On the other hand, we might embrace the risk of poor performance if allowing people to experiment is going to get us that rare breakthrough. So that's what fail fast is all about. And that's a very different performance management system where meritocracy may have to do with how many risks you took and how many failures you achieved, et cetera. And again, I'm going to suggest to you that this curve drawing is a way to be more explicit about what we mean. So it isn't just finding the pivot points, it's actually understanding the payoff curves for performance and getting a clear understanding about where quite vital work actually levels off. And the other two rows, the top and bottom row, I'm not going to cover them in any depth here. They're basically just other examples of taking management frameworks and retooling the risk that we see, retooling the way we think about HR risk. The top one is portfolio analysis, the way you invest in your own personal portfolio. And then the bottom one is an example from marketing where we take the idea of customer segmentation and consider it as segmenting our workforce in terms of how we design our offerings. And many of you are familiar with those, and again, we go into some depth on those in the seminar. So the idea is what we've done in the middle row is we took a model where leaders, I like to say, leaders are comfortable using their smart brain to make trade-offs between performance and cost and availability when it comes to products, when it comes to marketing, et cetera. That's the Kano diagram. Engineers are very smart when they're dealing with those trade-offs and they're using the Kano diagram on a product. They tend to be, honestly, less smart when they think of it as an HR issue, and they tend to say things like, I want a top performer in every job, I want people that are good at everything. I find that when I can retool their thinking and start them with the Kano diagram and then talk about performance management, we can dig deeper and we can understand more clearly where meritocracy makes sense, where we might want to pull back on meritocracy, and how we connect all that to strategy. Okay, I'm about to turn to a couple of other examples here as we go a little bit deeper into this concept, some favorite things that I've encountered in the work I'm doing with some of your companies and others. But for now, let me stop here and just take a breather and give the group a chance at about half past to ask a question or two if they'd like. I don't see any other questions typed in, so we may be fine. But let me stop for 10 or 15 seconds and just see if there's a question someone wants to verbally pose. So, Carrie, you can open things up, and I'll stop talking for a second.
Great. So I did notice that Jim has his hand up. So, Jim, if you still have a question, I have your line unmuted.
Sorry, I meant to turn it off. Thank you.
Oh, no worries.
Nope, sorry, you got to ask a question if you forgot to turn off your raised hand. I'm good.
All right, so we can just give it a couple more seconds to see if anybody's typing in the chat box.
Okay, great.
All right, we do have another hand up, and it's Annette. Just bear with me a second while I unmute the caller in line, because I'm not sure which one you are. Okay, Annette, are you there?
Yes, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Okay, we'll assume if it isn't typed in, maybe so it sounds like we're in pretty good shape. I'm going to continue, Carrie, then, and and I'll stop in a moment if we need to. So I'll give you another example. So maybe you can give do I need the control back, Carrie? Let me just see if that helps. Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm going to refer to this term ROIP. What that means is return on improved performance, and it has to do with this idea of understanding the curves. Again, not just finding the pivot points, which is kind of the popular version of some of what I'm talking about, but I'm beginning to think I need to encourage the profession to be better than that we need to be drawing curves and understanding trade-offs, not just looking for the pivot point. And let me give you an example here, very much about performance management. This is a real example, an example I've run into in several R&D organizations over the last year or two. All of them have something called a technical leader, a lead scientist, a lead inventor, a lead, software analyst, et cetera. And very often the profile of that job is someone who has a reputation of being a breakthrough thinker. They might have been a university professor or been in a think tank or something like that. They often hold lots of patents. They often have written lots of articles. And they create this job called a technical leader, and every job description I've seen has got a list of things in it, among them these three dimensions. One of them, the top one, is inventing new ideas. Be a big thinker, come up with breakthrough ideas, et cetera. The second one is leading inventors, head a team of big thinkers and help them to think better. I'll say I think I see Karen Paul on the line from 3M. She and I have talked a bit about this, though this is, let me say, in full disclosure, this is not necessarily an example from 3M. But she and I have talked about this pattern. And I'll let her disagree with me if I get it wrong in a moment. So inventing new ideas, leading the inventors, and then the other one is deploying the inventions that this group comes up with into the commercialization process. So I'm hoping you can all maybe put in your mind your R&D process, your invention process, et cetera, and think about a job. It probably has a different title, but you get the idea. And what I find working in organizations is that the three curves I've drawn here tend to be the going-in assumption. So remember, performance on the horizontal axis, strategic value on the vertical, and basically people behave, and the boilerplate, the formal description suggests that being good at all three is what we're after, and that improving on any one of the three, that is, let's call it meritocracy, on any of these three is equally valuable. Now, so then I get into the work, and I start to talk to people who are actually doing the jobs. And what I find is that there actually are often subsets of the work that are different kinds of jobs, even though they all have the same job description. So we have, let's say 15 technical leaders. Some of them are leadership jobs on the left side. The idea there is that it's, the fact that you're good at inventing new ideas is fine, but being better at that is less pivotal than helping these other young inventors be great. The same thing can be true in an invention job. Sometimes you've got a job where, yes, we want this big thinker to work with our commercialization process and deploy the invention into commercialization. As long as they're pretty good at that, that's fine, but we're still really looking to them for the big idea. And then, of course, you could also imagine a deployment job. I don't have the curve here, but you could imagine shifting the words deploy to the pivot point and then shifting the invention to the flat side. So, and what I find is that in the actual work, these technical leaders occupy spots in the process of invention that require, honestly, day-to-day, very different kinds of priorities. If you are a lead the inventors type of position, and you push too hard on demonstrating what a big thinker you are, you actually miss the collaboration part. That happens a lot. It's like a classic Silicon Valley story of promoting the best thinker and then realizing that lead the inventors was actually now pivotal. Same thing with deployment into commercialization. I often find jobs held by people that, frankly, are not the biggest thinker, are not creating all the patents these days, but they're unbelievably good at deploying into commercialization. Again, it's true that all three elements are still part of the job. So this isn't about so much saying that something doesn't exist or isn't important. You have to be good enough at all of these things, but the pivot one is often not all three. So again, if we go back one slide, it is not so much that the job looks like this, though that's how the job description and often the performance system treats it, but really that in reality it looks something like this. And again, to my point, Nancy, to your question, meritocracy applied as if the job looked like this, all 3 lines go up, can be pretty confusing and potentially pretty harmful to our strategy if the reality of the work looks like this. And what's striking to me is that very often this reality is not well captured because the same job description applies to everyone. And you find this reality by being clearer about how this work connects to processes, resources, and the strategy. So here I've summarized on the next slide kind of what happens and what got me interested in this and the symptoms that I see in organizations is if you have the left side, which is the way we behave, and then the right side, which is just one example of the 3 I gave you of the reality that some things level off. What happens is every organization has seen a leader once in a while that can do all 3 things well. And so you have the top leaders of the organization saying to HR, look, we've all seen, let's call it, Emily or Jack or somebody, and she or he was terrific at all 3 of these things. Just go get me more of them, and that will solve our strategy issue. Well, that's fine, but that's like telling an engineer, we once saw cold fusion happen. And if you can just make cold fusion happen in all of our products at room temperature, that'll solve our entire product development problem. And again, any good engineer is going to say, well, that's going to hamstring us a bit. It's a very small set of situations where that can happen. In the same way, what you find with HR is they're taking a long time to fill. I was talking to one organization that said, we hire only long experienced people for these jobs, and we cannot tap a graduate pool, of graduating students, because none of them have had the time to look like the graph on the left. But our reality is that you don't need the graph on the left. You often need something like the graph on the right. And if we could staff to that, we could let graduates be good enough on some things and hire them for being very good on another thing and develop them. So it creates gaps in your talent pipeline where you're not tapping certain sources. I think it creates confused and frustrated leaders who are trying to operate in a performance system that behaves like the left side is reality, but day to day they understand that the work is the right side of reality. And as we've seen, a diagram like the left one, when it doesn't apply, is really not well connected to processes, resources, and strategies right at the pivot point. So again, I'm hoping you're getting the idea about how these tools are a way for us to think a bit more clearly about what we mean by high performance, about what we mean by meritocracy, et cetera. And again, I use this technical leader example. I've written a couple of blogs about it because it does appear in many of the organizations that I'm working with as they put out a word like innovation, measure it with outcomes like the number of new products we introduce or something like that, and then expect people to make sense of how they contribute to it. And what I'm finding is that when we dig in deeper like this, we often find among the workers, among the leaders, among the technical leaders in this case, that they can articulate pretty clearly what those right-hand side diagrams look like. So even if you can't measure the curve becomes an interesting metaphor. The next 3 slides really just review what each curve means. So a straight line means getting good is about as good as offsets getting bad at about the same level. That might be something like sales or something like that. The next curve is what we call risk averse. This is a curve where preventing the bad thing is really what it's all about. And once someone is at standard, that's good enough, and they probably shouldn't be pushing real hard to improve. A lot of work in compliance is like this, getting the tax and other financial reports done on time and correct is what the standard is. If you don't do that, it's pretty harmful, but trying to show us how innovative you are about that doesn't really add value very much. And then this is one, I'm finding more and more examples in the emerging kind of gig economy. Carrie mentioned the book, The Future, or Lead the Work, that Robin J. Suthasan and David Creelman contributed to with me. A good example of this would be something like where you have an innovation riddle, and it can only be solved and only the perfect solution is going to get you the answer. So, drug development, very often some elements of software development. A very everyday example is a YouTube or social media-based video, something like that, where if it goes viral on the right-hand side, you've got an unbelievably high value. On the left-hand side, there aren't very many costs for making some mistakes on videos like that. So performance management may be all about encouraging people to just try things. And if you measure and you have meritocracy that says we'll reward you for the breakthrough, we will. But that can create a lot of wasted effort as people maybe are too conservative. So you get the idea. 3 different curves. There are probably other shapes as well. But to me, getting people to understand what these curves mean and giving them the freedom to tell us when their work, their job, or part of their work follows a different curve than a straight line can really open up, I think, some interesting conversations about the content of performance management, not just the process of performance management. I have a couple of other little stories here just to finish this thing off, and I may skip this one. I'm going to go back. This is just me. It really isn't Photoshopped. It's me on the deck of a carrier. And but let me go back to this diagram here and or the 3 curves, and just wait a moment and see if there's any other questions. We haven't seen much typing that I can see. And hopefully we don't have too many inadvertently raised hands in the list, but maybe I see one hand up, maybe 2, maybe people didn't turn it off yet. But let me just stop and see if people have questions.
You do have a question from Diane in the chat box.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, good. Thank you, Diane. So Diane says, how are organizations communicating, or what tools are they using to describe strategic value to employees? And does the same message go to all employees? It's a great question. I haven't done the research to know. I know this isn't quite what you're asking, Diane, but thank you very much for the question. I don't know exactly, I don't have a survey of the tools that organizations are using, so I may instead tell you a story. I think what's going on is there is a lot of experimentation with communication processes, and that's a good thing. The cloud, social media, et cetera, have opened up an enormous, soon-to-be virtual reality, holograms, avatars, it's opened up a massive number of new processes for communication. I think that in addition to things like newsletters, in addition to things like email blasts, town halls, et cetera, I'm sure all of you are using those kinds of things. So I think that's what I find is the kind of thing that is used to describe strategic value to employees, and it cascades down generally from a strategy formulated by the leadership team, and then in some of the best processes, each level of the organization is responsible for teaching the implications of that strategy in their unit. And some do it in very sophisticated and interesting ways using graphics, maybe those from Root Incorporated or something like that, to draw pictures. And you can, using that process, get people to dig deeply and say, how will the work that I do change given the change in the strategy, or where can I make my pivotal difference? So I would say that now that's kind of what I find is best practice. What's more typical, and I'll just tell you this story. I was doing a short session, a kind of fireside chat with a group of about 15 CEOs from Silicon Valley companies, and one of the things we asked them was, what's on your mind? What's the thing you want to talk about? What's an issue, the challenge that we want to share? And one of them said, my people don't understand our strategy, and I've done everything I can think of. I put it out there in a glossy book, and then people said, oh, well, you've got to have a webinar. And so I did a webinar, and we put that out there, and they said, well, you've got to have email chat. So I did that, and I answered questions, and he went through this whole litany of very good communication process changes, and his communication group was saying, let's try this, let's try that. And he said, we said, well, what do you mean by they don't understand it? And he said, I just don't feel like they're acting consistently with the strategy at a really deep level. And every head around the table nodded as if that was sort of to be expected. Like, yeah, that's a problem. They just don't seem to get the strategy. What we did was have a chat about these curves, actually, and I would let them tell you whether they found it useful. But it was a very interesting and engaged chat about, beyond saying be innovative, beyond saying be customer-centric, beyond saying we're moving into these new markets, we're going to build a plane out of composites, et cetera, could we be accountable for going to individuals and saying, what does that mean to you, and how does that change? And so it isn't the same message to all employees in the sense that certain kinds of work are going to contribute in different ways. Some work is going to be, let's call it, more pivotal than other work. That does not mean more important. It does not mean more vital. sometimes the less pivotal work is the work you have to pay attention to because people aren't at standard, so to speak. But meritocracy looks very different when what we're trying to do is get you to a standard than it does when we're trying to, say, excel. So I think that ultimately, this is what you're getting at, Diane, the message is different depending on the work that people do and depending on how that work pays off. And those payoff curves change as our strategy changes and as we progress and mature in our strategy. Sometimes the curve is very pivotal because we've got a problem and we need to get rid of low performance. Once we do and everybody's at standard, it makes sense to shift perhaps to something where there's a more pivotal element to look at. Thank you. Okay, looks like we're okay to finish up here. Carrie, let me just stop and see if anyone wants to raise their hand and verbally ask a question just in case.
You have a new question from Nancy in the chat box now.
Oh, yeah. You know, thank you, Nancy, for both of your questions. So it says, what does HR need to do to continue to drive this new way of thinking? And obviously I love the question. I'm kind of enamored of this way of thinking. So I'd love to see HR drive it a bit more. This is something that I've been working on for a long time, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer. Many of your organizations have been helpful in framing the ideas and experimenting with this. Today, what I'm talking about, Nancy, I think, is that we might step back and say, where in our performance management process, where in our reward process, our goal-setting process, might we be more precise about how the work actually pays off and how those payoffs change. So I think one answer is perhaps we can embed this kind of thinking into the work that we already do. I mean, leaders expect you to come to them with a system for helping them to coach, helping them to assess. So that performance management system, I think, is a fertile ground to subtly begin to bring these questions in. And maybe one of the good things about it is you don't need to necessarily do a deep strategy analysis in order to have a conversation about how the work is changing and what these curves might look like. Other places where you could start this kind of thinking have to do with leadership development. Again, what curves would make sense in terms of succession, et cetera. If you have the opportunity, very often questions about leadership development, succession, et cetera, are very close to questions about strategy. And so that's where you often have a chance to use, I'm going to skip ahead here just to the end to show the slide I need very quickly. Sorry, Carrie, you may have to give me back control. Let's see if I can go. So I don't know if I can do it, Carrie. Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you. Okay. So if you think about this model, in box 6, you can think about when we're executing policies and practices like performance management, incentives, et cetera, can we place these sorts of questions about the nature of the performance curves in there? All along 4, 5, and 6, really, you could say which interactions and actions need to be at standard, which ones need to be as good as possible. When you do succession planning, things like that, you're often in very much just a slight bit away from very deep questions about the strategy. What are we getting our leaders ready for? What is succession preparing us for? That's where I think you have an opportunity to work in the top part of the model, to say, look, to do this well, we need to go back up to our strategy and see the pivot points. And then work downward. So I don't want to imply that the only time you can do these curves would be when you have when you have the opportunity to do a very deep strategy analysis. That's what we simulate in the class in Chicago next month, is how to go through this whole process. But I think you can begin very often modestly where there's confusion, let's say, about performance, where your leaders are really pushing back on things like performance incentives or meritocracy, something that I think prompted, at least for me, my conversation with Alan Colquitt about, well, what are those situations where leaders say, it just doesn't make sense for me to try and get rid of the bottom 10%. It just doesn't make sense for us to put incentives on the top 10%. How can that be true? Isn't meritocracy always a good thing? Well, I think these curves help us answer, maybe not. We can be clearer with them. So I would say, modest starts are have the curves in mind, encourage your community to work with your friendly leaders who are interested in new ideas to maybe try this out, maybe gather some data in those places where your instincts are telling you the content of performance management may not be as clear as we might like. So I'm going to give you an idea about what else is in the slides here, since I think we'll have a PDF of them available. We've kind of covered the content that I wanted to cover, and Carrie, thank you very much. Again, the main message of today was perhaps step back and consider, is it possible that the concept of high performance isn't as clear as we might like it to be? And if the concept, if the meaning of high performance could be clearer, then does that mean that we might be able to be even more effective as we do our work, in this case on performance management or rewards, et cetera? Performance varies with strategy. I would say this idea of saying be a high performer, this idea of saying achieve high performance has very different meanings with the strategy and with the work situation. And I won't show the graphs, but the idea here is that it's not only the value curve in the bottom, which is the first bullet, but it's also the availability. It's a big difference if there are only a few people that can perform at a very high level, most people in the middle, and then a few people at the very bottom. That's the typical normal curve. But there are some situations, and research is increasingly uncovering them, where what we have is a world in which only a few people can really perform this task well. And the vast the population is going to be moderate or even not very good at it. That would be like something like invention, R&D, et cetera. When that availability curve exists, it poses some very interesting questions about whether or not we can even expect employment to solve the problem. Can we really expect to hire and retain the very few people that are likely to solve a riddle, or should we use something like freelancers, gamers, something like that? And then finally, performance cost. I think there isn't enough attention to the cost side of something like meritocracy. Both the cost of achieving high performance, what does it cost in terms of training, in terms of incentives, et cetera? Are we willing to be aggressive enough with those things when the payoff is really high? Do we apply those costs sometimes to things where the payoff is low, not because the work isn't vital, but because being at standard is the thing? And then finally, the general question, I think, of what are the unintended consequences of meritocracy and a blanket emphasis on high performance, and does that sometimes cause collateral damage in a way when people do not deeply understand where meritocracy, where high performance has the big payoff, and where good enough is sufficient? So perhaps I will leave you with that idea. I'm going to just skip to the bottom, which will allow me to thank you all, basically. So let's see if I can do this, Carrie. Okay, so there's the thank you slide. If you can go to the center and contact me or send me an email if you'd like, there's a few of the books. I'd encourage you to go to the CEO Center for Effective Organizations website, ceo.usc.edu, and perhaps take a look at the strategy seminar, which is coming up next month. We've still got a few spaces in that. And as I said, perhaps pose your questions back to me. Take a look at some of the work that Jerry Ledford and Ed Lawler are doing on performance management, some of the work at the Center on Agility, some of Alex's work on analytics, all of which feeds into the thinking you've seen here today. So with that, Carrie, I will stop and invite you to close us out today. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thanks, John, for a great webinar, and thanks everybody for joining. You'll get the email with the recording and the PDF slides tomorrow afternoon, and I'll include more information on the strategy seminar coming up. Thank you, and have a great day.